The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone as she clocked in at 5 in the morning, just like she had every morning for 8 months. Rachel Chen had become the kind of nurse that hospitals contained rather than celebrated. The one who arrived early, stayed late, asked no questions, and spent her breaks alone at the far end of the cafeteria with a book or a simple coffee, untouched. Nobody knew her. Nobody particularly wanted to know her. The hospital's hierarchy had sorted her quickly into the unspoken tier of invisible staff. The kind of person whose presence at a meeting meant nothing, whose suggestions were automatically overlooked, whose absence would barely register. The other nurses, particularly the ones who'd been at Metropolitan General for years, had made it clear within weeks of her arrival that she was surplus to their established ecosystem. They had their routines, their inside jokes, their shared understanding of how things worked in the wings and back corridors of this institution. Rachel was an outsider, someone who drifted in from nowhere with few details about her background and no connections to the local nursing community. She'd interviewed well on paper. Her resume showed solid experience. All her certifications were current, her references were adequate, but not glowing. Nothing about it screamed extraordinary. She was just another nurse, filling another slot, another pair of hands to assist when the real work was being done by the senior staff. The whispers had started small within the first week. During the morning huddle before her second shift, one of the senior nurses named Margaret had said loud enough for Rachel to hear, "We've got another one who's not going to work out." Another nurse had laughed and asked, "What makes you say that?" Margaret had just shrugged and said, "She's got that look, like she doesn't know what she's doing but won't admit it." The comment had stung, but Rachel had learned long ago that reacting to cuts only made them deeper. She'd simply continued prepping her station, making sure everything was perfect, making sure she knew every protocol and every procedure better than anyone else in the hospital. That's how she operated. Excellence in execution, invisibility in presence. By the third week, a pattern had established itself. When assignments were made, the better cases went to the nurses who were team members. The ones who laughed at Margaret's jokes, the ones who remembered everyone's birthday, the ones who fit into the established social structure. Rachel received the cases that nobody wanted. The long-term patients with complicated family situations, the behavioral cases that required patience and documentation, the high-maintenance admissions that demanded constant attention. She never complained. She simply took each assignment and handled it with meticulous professionalism. But professionalism, she'd learned, wasn't enough. Competence without the right social positioning was almost worthless. During a staff meeting 2 months into her employment, she gently suggested that the charting system being used for trauma patients could be streamlined by implementing a different order of documentation, getting vital signs and initial assessment first, before moving to medical history. It would save time, reduce errors, and improve the speed of handoff. She'd even researched it, preparing her thoughts carefully, phrasing it as a suggestion rather than a criticism. Dr. Harrison had been in that meeting. He'd listened while Margaret, the senior nurse, had explained Rachel's idea. Then he'd said simply, "The system we use works fine. It's worked for years. I don't see a need to change it." That was the end of discussion. What Rachel didn't know in that moment was that what looked like rejection was actually something worse. It was the moment the institutional decision had been made about her. She had challenged the system. She had implied that people who'd been doing things for years were doing them wrong. That wasn't being a good team member. That was being presumptuous. The coldness that followed was calculated and comprehensive. Margaret stopped assigning Rachel to the better cases. When Rachel spoke during shift handoffs, people found reasons to look at their phones. In the break room, conversations would pause when she entered. then resume after she left. It was the kind of bullying that left no marks, no explicit violations of conduct policy, nothing that could be documented or complained about. It was just the slow, systematic removal of professional respect. One afternoon, nearly 4 months into her employment, Rachel had been standing at the nursing station when she overheard Margaret talking to another nurse about her. Rachel's not bad at what she does, technically. But she doesn't understand nursing. She doesn't understand that this is about relationships, about knowing how to work with people, about fitting into a team. She's probably fine at the mechanical parts. But that's not what nursing is. Nursing is about empathy, about being part of something bigger than yourself. She's just going through the motions. Rachel had stood very still. She'd wanted to turn around and tell Margaret exactly what nursing was, what it had meant in her previous life, what it had meant in places where the stakes were incalculably higher, where her empathy had quite literally determined whether people lived or died. But she couldn't say those things. She couldn't explain who she was, where she'd come from, or why she'd chosen to be invisible. So she had simply finished her charting and gone about her shift. The only person who seemed to see her at all was old Mr. Patel, a patient who'd been admitted with congestive heart failure and a secondary respiratory infection. He came in on her shift, and Rachel took his case. She'd spent time with him, not just doing the required observations, but actually talking to him. He was a widower, had been for 3 years, had 3 adult children who called but rarely visited. He was lonely in the way that hospital patients often were, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. Rachel had noticed the particular quality of his loneliness. She'd recognized it. She'd sat with him for 15 minutes during a break, not documenting anything, not performing any clinical task. She'd just listened to him talk about his wife, about the life they'd had, about the garden he maintained alone. When she came on shift and he told her goodnight, he'd reached out and squeezed her hand. "You're the first person here who's treated me like I'm still a person," he'd said. "Not just a case, not just a problem to be managed. A person." That moment had meant more to Rachel than any institutional recognition could have. She'd taken care of Mr. Patel through his stay, and when he was discharged, he'd made a point of asking for her one last time. She'd wheeled him out to the curb where his daughter was picking him up, and he'd told his daughter, "This one right here, this nurse, she's the real deal. She's the kind of person you want taking care of you." His daughter had looked at Rachel with something approaching awe. But Rachel had just smiled and said, "I'm glad he's feeling better. I hope his recovery continues smoothly." She'd gone back inside and moved on to the next patient. The recognition from Mr. Patel had been genuine, but it had also been private. The institutional culture had not shifted 1 degree because an elderly patient knew she was good at her job. By month 8, Rachel had settled into a kind of resigned equilibrium. She was good at the work. She knew she was good at it. The institution did not need to recognize her competence for her to know it existed. The other nurses could exclude her from their social ecosystem, could make assignments based on politics rather than patient needs, could undermine her in small ways that no one could officially document. She could bear it. She had borne worse. What she didn't know was that she was being observed by someone else. One of the hospital's senior residents, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, had noticed Rachel over the past months. She'd noticed how Rachel's patients seemed to have better outcomes despite being assigned the more difficult cases. She'd noticed how Rachel's charting was meticulous, detailed in ways that actually made the doctor's job easier rather than harder. She'd noticed that Rachel asked the right kinds of questions when she did speak up. questions that suggested deep clinical thinking rather than mere instruction following. Dr. Okonkwo had come to the conclusion that Rachel was training herself to be invisible because the hospital's culture didn't reward competence. It rewarded social positioning. And that was a tragedy. But Sarah had no power to change that. She was a resident, still establishing herself, still learning not to offend the senior attending physicians who controlled her future. She could appreciate Rachel's excellence privately, but she could not publicly vindicate it. Not yet. Not unless something happened that forced the question of real competence into the light. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's senior attending physician and head of emergency medicine, represented everything about the medical hierarchy that ground against Rachel's every instinct. He was brilliant, technically masterful, and wielded his intelligence like a weapon crafted specifically for the purpose of making other people feel small. Harrison had come from money, attended the most prestigious schools, and had never experienced the particular education of being underestimated. His family had been physicians for 3 generations. Medical authority wasn't something he'd earned. It was something he'd inherited, and he carried it with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to prove anything to anyone who mattered. He treated nurses as task executors, implementers of his superior vision rather than colleagues with independent knowledge or valuable perspective. The hospital's entire culture flowed downward from his contempt for the nursing profession. He made it known, consistently and without apology, that nurses were technicians, not professionals. Medical decisions were made by doctors. Everything else was implementation. If Harrison didn't respect the nursing staff, nobody had to, and the message was clear throughout the institution. Margaret's dismissive attitude toward Rachel reflected Harrison's broader worldview. That nurses who tried to think medically, who asked questions, who suggested alternatives, were stepping outside their role. They were being presumptuous. 6 months ago, Rachel had made the mistake of questioning a medication order. A patient had come in for post-operative pain management following an appendectomy. Dr. Harrison had ordered a specific combination of medications that, Rachel had noticed from her review of the patient's chart, seemed problematic. The patient had a documented history of sensitivity to one of the medications. It was right there in the allergy section, though marked as a sensitivity rather than a true allergy. The dosage Harrison had prescribed was standard, but for someone with that particular sensitivity, it could create a problematic interaction. Rachel had approached Harrison carefully, respectfully, in a private setting rather than challenging him publicly. She'd said, "Dr. Harrison, I wanted to verify something about the pain management order. The patient has a documented sensitivity to naproxen, not an allergy, but a sensitivity. The combination you've prescribed includes naproxen as part of the pain management protocol. Is that intentional, or should we consider an alternative?" She had been as deferential as she could possibly be. She had framed it as a verification, not a challenge. She had given him multiple outs. He could have said he'd intentionally chosen naproxen despite the sensitivity, or he could have thanked her for catching it. What he'd done instead was look at her with something approaching contempt. "Your job is to administer what I prescribe, not to think about why," he'd said, his voice level and cold. "I've been practicing medicine for 23 years. I understand medication interactions better than you ever will. The patient's sensitivity is well below the threshold of clinical concern for this dosage. The naproxen is an essential part of the pain management protocol. Leave the diagnosis and treatment decisions to people trained for it. That's what you're here for." He'd turned away, and the conversation was over. Rachel had not challenged the order. She had administered the medications exactly as prescribed. The patient had experienced no adverse effects. Harrison was, after all, competent despite his manner. But the message had been unmistakable. Nurses did not question doctors. Nurses did not think about the medical dimensions of care. Nurses implemented. That was the boundary, and it was not negotiable. That comment had been 6 months ago. She had not questioned anything since. She had simply absorbed the lesson that her clinical thinking was unwelcome, that her observation and analysis were threatening rather than valuable, that her role was to be hands without a mind. The morning everything changed started like 1,000 others. Rachel was processing new admits around 6:30 when the emergency alert system triggered. Helicopter inbound, multiple injuries, estimated arrival 6 minutes. The hospital shifted into controlled chaos. Teams mobilized. Preparation began. She moved through her tasks with the precise efficiency she'd developed over months of making herself indispensable while remaining invisible. The emergency department transformed in seconds from the routine early morning rhythm to a state of tactical readiness. Resuscitation bays were cleared, equipment was verified. IV lines were prepared, medications were staged. The entire institution focused its collective attention on the unknown crisis that was approaching. By the time the helicopter's rotor blades were audible over the building, Rachel had already positioned herself at Station 3, checking medication stocks with meticulous attention, confirming IV supplies were ready in the precise order they'd be needed, ensuring monitors were functioning and sensors were clean and properly positioned. She'd also mentally rehearsed every possible emergency scenario: hemorrhagic shock, tension pneumothorax, pericardial tamponade, traumatic amputation. In her previous life, this kind of mental preparation had been absolute necessity. Here at Metropolitan General, it was simply what she did. Everyone assumed she was just being conscientious. Nobody needed to know that her level of preparation came from having actually treated trauma cases in field conditions, where the margin between life and death could be measured in minutes. The helicopter landed on the roof. The team emerged, moving with military precision that Rachel immediately recognized. The moment she saw them, something in her body responded. A subtle shift in her nervous system, a recognition of professional brothers and sisters in a world that this hospital's ordinary culture knew nothing about. These weren't standard civilian paramedics. These were tactical combat medics, trained by Special Operations Command, operating under protocols that civilian medicine didn't use. The patient came in on a military-grade stretcher, surrounded by what Rachel immediately recognized as Special Operations medical personnel. Her entire nervous system went silent for just one moment, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming collision of her two lives. There was something about the way they moved, the tactical precision of their actions, the training evident in every gesture. They were different from civilian paramedics. They carried themselves with the weight of operations she didn't need to know about. Classified deployments, theaters of operation that didn't exist in official records. She could read the subtle signs in their gear, the way they'd rigged the stretcher, the medications they'd already administered. They were different because they'd trained in a different world. The patient was male, approximately 54, unconscious, with a penetrating abdominal wound that had been field stabilized with professional expertise, but was clearly beyond what routine emergency response could handle. His abdomen showed the distension of internal bleeding. His skin had the particular quality of someone who'd lost significant blood volume. The monitors they were connected to showed BP of 88/48, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 36, the vital signs of someone in profound hemorrhagic shock. Incoming, the flight medic reported directly to Dr. Harrison, who'd arrived moments before the patient, moving with the commanding authority that came with having never been challenged. Male, approximately 54, gunshot wound to the left lower quadrant, sustained in the field approximately 2 hours ago. We've got him on Mark's protocol. Massive transfusion with blood, plasma, and platelets already started. He's received 2 units whole blood in flight. His vitals are bottoming, BP 88/48 and dropping with each minute. Heart rate through the roof. We need a surgical suite and a surgeon standing by. He's got maybe 30 minutes before this becomes unsalvageable. The flight medic's tone was utterly professional. But Rachel could hear what was underneath. The message that they were handing over a patient who was dying, and the only question was whether he would die in flight or on the operating table. "Doctor?" Harrison nodded with his usual command center authority, the kind of confidence that came from genuine technical competence paired with absolute certainty in his own judgment. "Trauma 1. Get him up there. Full trauma activation. Type and cross for 8 units. Prepare O negative now, and I want blood bank ready to go. Surgical team on standby. Let's move. Who's on anesthesia this morning?" "Dr. Roberts, fresh in," one of the nurses responded. "Good. Tell him we've got a massive transfusion protocol incoming. I'm thinking penetrating abdominal trauma with likely solid organ involvement. We'll need full capacity." Rachel followed the stretcher upward with the rest of the team. But something in her training, something that ran deeper than 8 months of invisible nursing at Metropolitan General, recognized the problem before Harrison had even finished diagnosing it. The hemorrhage pattern was wrong for what Harrison was describing. Yes, there was significant abdominal bleeding. Yes, the patient was in hemorrhagic shock. But the specific quality of the shock, the particular trajectory of the vital signs, the degree of abdominal distension, the pattern of perfusion, all of it suggested something more complex than straightforward solid organ injury. The bleeding pattern indicated not just abdominal bleeding, but something deeper. Something that suggested the penetration had gone further than the entry wound indicated. In her previous training, she'd been taught to read these signs with absolute precision, because in a forward medical station, you didn't have CT scans or ultrasound. You had your hands, your eyes, and your judgment. The pattern she was seeing now, the shock that was worse than the apparent blood loss should create. The abdominal distension that suggested massive internal hemorrhage, the quality of the patient's skin and the pattern of his perfusion, suggested mesenteric vascular injury. Mesenteric vessel injury was different from solid organ injury. The bleeding could be catastrophic because the mesenteric arteries didn't have natural protection. They didn't collapse the way peripheral vessels did when they bled. They just kept bleeding into the peritoneal cavity massive volumes until the patient died. She watched the monitors as they moved through the hallway. His pressure continued to drop despite the aggressive fluid resuscitation the flight medics had started. His abdomen was distending further. The bleeding wasn't from a contained source like a spleen or kidney that might clot off on its own. It was internal, massive, and the surgical team was being prepared for the wrong problem. If they went in expecting solid organ injury and found mesenteric bleeding, they'd lose precious minutes repositioning, changing their approach, adapting. In hemorrhagic shock, minutes mattered. Every minute mattered. She said nothing. She'd learned 8 months ago the cost of speaking up to Dr. Harrison, and that lesson had been reinforced repeatedly. A nurse who questioned a physician's diagnosis was a nurse who was stepping out of her role. A nurse who questioned Harrison was a nurse who was being presumptuous about her own competence. She had made her choice months ago to be invisible, to be competent only in the execution of others' decisions. She would maintain that choice now. In Trauma 1, Harrison supervised the patient's transfer to the surgical table with the smooth confidence of someone who'd handled hundreds of critical cases and had never lost the faith that his judgment was sound. Rachel stood to the side, assisting when directed, watching the monitors, watching the surgeon's face, watching the flight medics as they briefed the surgical team. The surgical team was efficient. Draping began. The patient was prepped in the ritualistic dance of emergency surgical procedure. Harrison called for the surgical team to proceed with what he'd diagnosed: a straightforward repair of the penetrating abdominal trauma with likely injury to the intestinal tract. Small bowel injuries were very survivable if caught early. Solid organ injuries could be managed. Vascular injuries were different. But Harrison had clearly decided that wasn't the problem here. "Let's get him opened up," Harrison instructed. "We're looking for penetrating injury to the small bowel, possibly the colon. Careful dissection. Let's identify the injury and repair it. Watch for collateral damage to adjacent structures." The surgical team moved with precision. The initial incision was made, the peritoneum was opened, and in the moment when the surgical field came into direct view, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that her assessment had been correct. The bleeding wasn't from the intestinal tract. It was from the mesenteric vessels, the major blood supply system running through the abdomen, the network of arteries and veins that provided circulation to all of the small intestine and parts of the colon. The hemorrhage was catastrophic, massive, far beyond what the patient could survive if it continued unchecked. The surgical field was flooded with blood, despite the ongoing resuscitation. The patient's heart rate was climbing toward unsustainable levels. His blood pressure was barely detectable. They'd been looking for the wrong problem while the right one killed the patient beneath their hands. Harrison's face underwent a rapid series of transformations. Initial confusion as he processed that what he was seeing didn't match what he'd expected. Then the hard set of someone about to make command decisions under extreme pressure. He'd already opened the patient. Closing now, referring to another surgeon. That would be admitting error, losing the patient to time. The only way through this now was forward, through the crisis, and into whatever came on the other side. "Increased suction," he commanded, his voice still controlled, but with a thin edge of strain underneath. "I need to see the hemorrhage source. Let's identify the bleed. Retract the small bowel, get it out of the field. I need visualization." The surgical team moved, executing his commands with precision, but Rachel could see what was about to happen. The standard approach to mesenteric bleeding, the approach that Harrison would naturally default to, involved gaining access from the proximal end, trying to control the bleeding vessel from above where it originated. But in this configuration, with this much blood loss already, with the surgical field this compromised, that approach wasn't going to work. He'd spend minutes trying to get proximal control, and in those minutes, the patient would continue to bleed. The blood loss would worsen. The shock would deepen. By the time he got control, the patient would be dead or so profoundly damaged that survival would be questionable. Rachel had trained to recognize this problem. She had trained to solve it under conditions far more austere than a modern operating room. She'd done her training in field hospitals, in forward surgical teams, in operating theaters where there was no backup, no extra surgeons, no blood bank standing ready with unlimited supply. In those conditions, you learned alternate techniques because the standard techniques assumed resources you didn't have. She knew the alternate technique, the one that combat medics and forward surgical teams used in exactly these circumstances. Manual compression of the bleeding point. Temporary occlusion that gave you just enough time to gain posterior access, to approach the bleeding vessel from the back, to get visualization and control without spending critical minutes trying for proximal approach. She knew it because combat surgeons operated on this principle in field conditions where time mattered more than perfect anatomy. She knew it because she'd assisted in the procedure, had performed parts of it, had trained in exactly this scenario. She stood still at the periphery of the surgical field and said nothing. The monitors continued their descent. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped toward critical levels. The anesthesiologist's voice became tighter. "Sats are dropping. Heart rate is climbing. We're losing him. We need better hemorrhage control now." Harrison's hands continued their movements. But Rachel could see he was applying the standard approach, the approach he'd learned in his training, the approach that assumed you had time and proximal access was possible. But the surgical field didn't allow for it. The bleeding was too much. The patient's physiology was too compromised. The patient's heart monitor began its descent toward flatline. The rhythm weakened. The rate became irregular. The anesthesiologist's voice became urgent. "Profound bradycardia, dropping toward asystole. We're losing him. He's going into irreversible shock." Harrison's voice remained controlled, but had lost the easy authority that characterized his usual demeanor. "We're losing him. Getting no hemostasis here. Standard approach isn't working. I'm going to need to..." But his words trailed off because he didn't actually know what he was going to do. He was a surgeon of genuine skill, but his training assumed that standard technique would work. When it didn't, when the anatomical access he expected wasn't available, he was for the first time truly uncertain. Rachel moved forward. The room went quiet. Every protocol had been violated the moment she stepped into the surgical field without being called. The moment she crossed the barrier between nursing assistance and medical decision-making. But the patient's oxygen saturation was 40% and dropping, and his heart was moving toward a rhythm that no resuscitation protocol could bring back. "If you move the retractor posterior and occlude manually first, you can get access to the SMA above the bleeding point," she said quietly. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. This voice that had said almost nothing for 8 months in this hospital, that had been trained to remain silent and invisible. She was speaking now in English, in a hospital setting. But the training underneath was decades old and came from a completely different world. Control the artery proximally to the wound with manual compression. That buys you maybe 2 minutes. In that window, you can open the retroperitoneum posteriorly and get visualization of the vessel from the back. You'll be able to see where the bleeding is coming from and place your repair without fighting through the hemorrhage field. The OR froze. Everyone in the room knew that Rachel had just crossed a line that was supposed to be inviolable. Nurses did not give clinical direction to surgeons during procedures. Nurses did not suggest alternate surgical techniques. Nurses assisted. They did not direct. The power structure of the operating room depended on clear hierarchy, and Rachel had just violated it catastrophically. Dr. Harrison's eyes met hers. The look he gave her was not anger, at least not in that moment. It was something more complex, something like recognition mixed with rage, the expression of someone realizing that the person who'd been beneath their notice had just stepped into the light. And moreover, that person clearly knew what they were talking about. "A nurse does not direct my surgery," he said, but his hands hesitated. He could feel it too, the truth of what she'd said, the technical correctness of her suggestion, the fact that standard approach was failing while his patient died on the table. "No," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the absolute violation of protocol she was committing. "But I'm directing you to save this man's life instead of killing him with a standard technique that doesn't fit this anatomy. The technique I described gives you the window you need. You have maybe 90 seconds before this patient is deceased. And then it doesn't matter what technique you use, because there won't be a patient to save." 80 years of surgical tradition hung suspended in the air. The understanding that hierarchy was absolute, that physicians commanded and nurses obeyed, that to suggest alternatives was to be presumptuous about one's own competence and place. But underneath that tradition was something older. The understanding that the patient on the table mattered more than the hierarchy around them. Harrison's hands moved. He changed his approach. He positioned the retractor differently, angling it to give him access to the deeper structures. He performed the manual compression that Rachel had suggested, using his hand to apply direct pressure to the superior mesenteric artery, stopping the catastrophic bleeding flow long enough to shift his position. Then, with the surgical team responding to his rapid redirection, he opened the retroperitoneum, gaining access from the posterior approach, the angle that allowed him to see the bleeding vessel from the back. The hemorrhage point came into view. A small, high-pressure tear in the superior mesenteric artery, exactly where Rachel had mentally placed it, based on the clinical signs. The bleeding that would have been invisible from the anterior approach, obscured by the blood in the surgical field, was now visible. Harrison worked with focused intensity, gaining control, placing his repair, restoring the circulation. It took perhaps 15 minutes from the time he switched techniques to the time the bleeding was controlled and the vessel was repaired. The patient's heart rate, which had been dropping toward flatline, began to stabilize. His oxygen saturation, which had dropped to dangerous levels, began to climb. His blood pressure, which had been unmeasurable, began to respond to the massive transfusion protocol. By the time Harrison placed the final closure, the monitors showed something that, 30 seconds before, had seemed impossible. A patient who was going to survive. The room remained quiet. Nobody spoke. The surgical team continued their work finishing the case, closing the abdomen, completing the standard procedures that would follow any major surgery. But the electricity in the room had fundamentally shifted. Rachel had stepped outside of her role, violated protocol, and saved a patient's life. And more problematically for Dr. Harrison, she had done it by knowing something that a highly trained surgeon had not known, or at least had not been able to apply in the moment. When the monitors showed genuine stability, when the patient had been transferred to the ICU, when the immediate crisis had resolved, Harrison looked up at Rachel exactly once. The look he gave her was not gratitude. It was something far more dangerous. It was the look of a man realizing that he'd been made to look foolish, that someone beneath him had corrected him, that his authority had been undermined in front of his entire surgical team. By the time Rachel had changed out of her surgical scrubs and was back in her regular nursing scrubs, Dr. Harrison had decided what her intervention meant. She had undermined him. She had spoken out of turn. She had violated the chain of command in the surgical environment. She had made him look like he didn't know what he was doing in front of his entire team, in front of the anesthesiologist, in front of the surgical nurses who would carry this story through the hospital. She had made him look stupid, and that was something Harrison could not forgive. By 6:30 that morning, Rachel had been back in her regular scrubs, finishing documentation on the emergency case. The patient had been transferred to the ICU stable. Her shift was over, but she'd stayed to ensure everything was documented with precision, what she'd been trained to do. When Harrison found her at the nursing station, she knew what was coming. She could read it in the tension of his shoulders, his clenched hands, the rigid control over his expression. "My office," he said quietly. "Now, bring your personal belongings." The walk to his office felt ceremonial. Staff members watched as she passed. The story had already transformed from "nurse saved patient's life" to "nurse was insubordinate, questioned surgeon, violated chain of command." The narrative had been written before she ever sat down. His office was cold and professional, mahogany desk, framed diplomas, evidence of authority. He closed the door and settled into his chair. making her stand while he sat. "You've worked here 8 months," he began without preamble. "Your performance has been adequate but forgettable. Today you crossed a line I cannot permit. You questioned my medical judgment. You gave orders in my operating room. You violated protocol and the hierarchy that allows a hospital to function. You made me look foolish in front of my team." Rachel said nothing. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Your performance will be documented as unsuitable for continued work. Security will escort you out. You'll surrender your badge and access cards. I'm documenting this as termination for misconduct. That will impact your ability to work at any serious institution. You are finished in nursing at this hospital." Security waited outside. 2 large officers. Rachel had no intention of resisting. She had made her choice, and now she would bear the consequences. The walk down the corridor with security flanking her became the defining image. Nurses watched from stations. Patients understood what it meant. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge the hierarchy. She walked with her head up, her bag holding personal effects. Her badge had been surrendered. The officers flanked her through the lobby as people stopped to watch. The morning light outside was bright and cold. Rachel walked to the edge of hospital property where the security detail stopped. One officer said, "You're released to the public." And she understood. She was no longer hospital property. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Her career at Metropolitan General was over. She looked back at the building, at the windows where staff began their day, unaware of the institutional narrative shift. From this moment forward, she would be the insubordinate nurse who'd questioned a surgeon's judgment. Rachel walked toward the bus stop, her head steady, her gaze forward. She'd faced worse than this. She'd lived worse. By 1 in the afternoon, things had begun to happen in corridors of power that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The patient Rachel had saved, the one with the mesenteric artery tear, the one who should have died under standard protocol, was not the average gunshot victim. He was Marcus Webb, a deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He had been wounded in an operation so classified that the details would never surface in public record. He had been rushed to Metropolitan General because it was the closest trauma center, not because anyone expected the local staff to know what they were doing. Within the first hour of regaining consciousness, before his family was even notified, before the standard paperwork was processed, Marcus Webb had asked for the nurse who saved his life. The surgical team had mentioned her name, Rachel Chen, and had described the technique she'd recommended. The moment those details were communicated up the chain, the machinery of institutional power had begun to move. Dr. James Harrison was in his office when his pager went off. The message was simple. Report to the Secretary of Defense immediately. The Secretary of Defense. Not a call. Not a request. A command delivered with the kind of official authority that meant something was already in motion. Harrison's stomach had understood faster than his conscious mind. He was walking toward his car before the full implications had caught up to him. By 2 o'clock, the Secretary of Defense himself had made the decision to fly to Metropolitan General. The patient who'd been saved was connected to too many classified operations, too many ongoing intelligence networks, too many strategic assets. The fact that he'd been rescued from near certain death due to the intervention of someone extraordinary warranted direct attention. By 3, the motorcade was en route. The hospital's administration had been briefed at 3:30. The message was cryptic but absolute. Someone from the federal government would be arriving at the hospital. Cooperation was not requested, It was expected. Full facility access would be provided. The patient, Marcus Webb, was to be given enhanced security. And there was one more instruction that made Dr. Harrison's recent actions suddenly look like a catastrophic miscalculation. The Secretary of Defense had specifically requested information about Rachel Chen. At 4 o'clock, Rachel was at her apartment, staring at a wall and trying to figure out how to file an unemployment claim when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Rachel Chen?" The voice was professional, military in its cadence. "Yes." "This is Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, military aide to the Secretary of Defense. I'm calling to inform you that your employment termination is under federal review. Please remain available. You will likely be contacted by federal personnel within the hour." The call ended before she could respond. The motorcade arrived at Metropolitan General at 4:45 in the afternoon. Black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the main entrance. Security personnel moved with the practiced precision of people who protected the most powerful leaders in the country. And then, as the hospital staff watched from windows and hallways, the Secretary of Defense himself stepped out of the vehicle. He was in full dress uniform, the weight of his rank and authority visible in every measured step. He was flanked by 6 Secret Service agents and 3 military aides. He was angry. The hospital's chief administrator, David Chen, rushed to meet him in the lobby. "Secretary Williams, welcome to Metropolitan General. We have prepared—" "Where is Dr. James Harrison?" Williams' voice cut through the administrator's greeting like a knife. He's in his office. I can have him brought down immediately." "Do that." "And where is Rachel Chen?" She was terminated this morning. She's not at the hospital currently, but I can provide you with her contact information." "Bring her back," Secretary Williams said. "Now, federal transport if necessary. She is to be treated as a VIP consultant to the federal government, effective immediately." Within 20 minutes, Rachel was in a car with a military driver, being transported back to the hospital. Within 35 minutes, she was walking through the same doors that security had dragged her through 8 hours before. She wore regular clothes, not scrubs. But the moment she stepped into that lobby, the entire dynamic had transformed. Hospital staff recognized her. Security stood at attention rather than forming an escort of removal. The power had shifted so completely that the space itself seemed to have reorganized around her presence. Dr. Harrison was already waiting in the hospital's main conference room when Secretary Williams entered. The Secretary of Defense was in full dress uniform, the weight of his rank visible in every movement. He sat down without pleasantries, and his expression suggested that he'd already made every decision that mattered in this conversation. "Dr. Harrison, I've been briefed on the surgical emergency this morning. I want to hear it from you. Walk me through your treatment decisions and your reasoning." Harrison's mouth had gone dry. His hands felt unsteady. The patient came in with a penetrating abdominal wound from a gunshot. I made the clinical decision that the injury was limited to the intestinal tract, based on the entry wound and initial presentation. I proceeded with the standard surgical approach for that diagnosis, anterior exploration. During the surgery, I determined the actual injury was more extensive than I initially understood, vascular injury, and I adjusted my technique accordingly. The patient was successfully stabilized and is recovering in the ICU. "You made a clinical decision that would have resulted in the patient's death," Secretary Williams said coldly, his voice cutting like a blade. "You made a diagnostic error and a surgical error. Your standard approach failed because your initial assessment was incorrect. You misread the patient's presentation. You missed the critical element. If Rachel Chen had not overridden your judgment and recommended an alternate technique, Marcus Webb would be dead right now. Not injured, dead. And Marcus Webb, as you should know if you had any awareness of the implications of your work this morning, carries classified information that affects ongoing national security operations. His death would have created consequences that ripple through multiple intelligence networks and international relationships. You nearly killed a man essential to national defense because you were too proud to listen. I did adjust during surgery. Because a nurse had to save you from your own incompetence. A nurse who you then fired, terminated on the spot, for the profound sin of preventing a disaster. A nurse who, had she not been highly trained in combat medicine and classified medical procedures that go far beyond standard nursing curriculum, would have let your mistake become a federal incident. The words landed like hammer strikes. Harrison's face had gone pale. His hands were trembling. Rachel Chen's military record is highly classified. The secretary continued, his voice taking on a quality that suggested he was controlling anger with significant effort. But I am authorized to tell you that she served as a combat medic with the Special Operations Command Central, that she underwent medical training far beyond standard nursing curriculum, that she has multiple classified commendations, including the Defense Meritorious Service Medal and the Bronze Star, for medical excellence under fire, and that her decision to intervene in that operating room was exactly the kind of excellence and judgment I expect from military personnel. More importantly, it's the kind of judgment I would have expected from you if you were actually qualified for the position you hold. You are not. Harrison wanted to speak, to defend himself, but nothing came. There was no defense. The facts were absolute. Your approach was textbook standard. Your diagnosis was wrong. Your surgical technique was inadequate for this anatomy. And the only reason this patient is alive is because someone you apparently considered beneath notice recognized the problem you could not solve and had the courage to speak when her career depended on silence. That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment. The door to the conference room opened. Rachel entered, flanked by a military aide. She stood quietly while the Secretary of Defense continued. I'm recommending your immediate termination from this hospital, Dr. Harrison. I'm also communicating with the State Medical Board about whether your licensure should be subject to review. You had a chance to learn from the best when that moment was offered to you, and instead you decided to destroy her career. That was a failure of leadership, of judgment, and of basic human decency. Harrison looked at Rachel. For the first time, she met his eyes directly. There was no triumph in her expression. There was simply clarity, the look of someone who had been invisible because she had chosen to be, and who could, at any moment, choose otherwise. Ms. Chen, Secretary Williams continued, on behalf of the Department of Defense, I apologize for the institutional failure that led to your wrongful termination. Your record speaks for itself. You have my personal authorization to name your terms regarding employment and position at any medical facility in this country. You have options that very few people will ever have. Rachel spoke quietly. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. But what I want is to go back to work. I want to keep doing what I've been doing. I want to save lives. I don't want titles or special treatment. I just want to be allowed to do my job. It was perhaps the most powerful thing she could have said in that moment. She wasn't interested in power. She wasn't interested in the Secretary of Defense's offer of authority. She was interested only in returning to the things she actually cared about. The patient in front of her, the life that could be saved, the work itself. The hospital's administration faced a choice that was no longer a choice at all. Dr. Harrison would be gone. Rachel would remain. And the message would be absolutely clear. Excellence does not come from titles and hierarchy. It comes from knowledge, training, and the willingness to step in when lives are at stake. The bullying, the invisible treatment, the culture of condescension, all of it had been wrong. All of it had been contemptible. And now everyone could see it clearly. By 6 o'clock that evening, Rachel was back in her scrubs, working in the emergency department. The other nurses, the ones who had dismissed her, who had mocked her, who had made her feel unwelcome, now looked at her with completely transformed comprehension. She was the same person she had always been. But the invisible context had become visible. The hidden training had been revealed. The extraordinary capability that she deliberately downplayed was now impossible to ignore. She moved through her shift the same way she had moved through every shift for 8 months. With precision, with care, with complete professional focus. The only difference was that now, when she spoke up about a patient, people listened. When she made a suggestion, staff took it seriously. When she made a request, it was treated with the respect it deserved. None of it was because the Secretary of Defense had validated her. It was because she had always been worthy of respect, and now everyone finally had to acknowledge it. The lesson wasn't complicated, but it was profound. The people we dismiss are not necessarily the people we can afford to dismiss. The quiet ones might be quiet because they are above the noise. The ones who don't compete for status might not care about status because they already have something more important: actual competence, actual training, actual worth. We judge people by their presentation, by their willingness to claim authority, by their ability to navigate social hierarchies. But those metrics tell us almost nothing about actual capability. Rachel Chen had been judged by every external measure and found wanting. She had been invisible, bullied, disrespected, and finally fired for the crime of being better at something that mattered than the person in charge. She had not fought back. She had not claimed her worth. She had simply done the work, and in the moment when it actually mattered, when a life hung in the balance, what she actually was had superseded what everyone had decided she was. The question that hung in the air after that day was not about Rachel. It was about every hospital, every institution, every hierarchy that still operated on the assumption that authority and competence were synonymous. They are not. Sometimes the person you are bullying has already done things you will never do. Sometimes the nurse you dismissing is trained at a level you cannot reach. Sometimes the person at the bottom of the social order has already seen things that would change everything if you knew them. The only question is whether we are paying attention, whether we are building systems that value actual competence over the appearance of authority, whether we are creating environments where someone like Rachel feels safe being visible rather than safe being invisible. That is the real work. That is the actual change that needed to happen. And that is the story that matters. The sun set on Metropolitan General as the evening shift took over. Rachel was already gone, heading home to process the day. The Secretary of Defense was back in his motorcade, heading to the airport. Dr. Harrison was clearing out his office. And somewhere in the hospital, Marcus Webb was waking up, his life extending far beyond the moment it should have ended, because someone with real training had been standing in a room when it mattered. That was the end of the story that everyone wanted to see. But the real end was much simpler. Rachel went back to work. She saved more lives. And nobody at Metropolitan General would ever again confuse visibility with worth. If you love this story about justice, about the hidden strength in quiet people, about the moment when truth breaks through hierarchy, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. so you never miss when Code Whisperers reveals the stories hidden behind the uniforms and the ordinary faces. These are the real heroes, and they are everywhere.